I'll just introduce everybody. I think a lot of people probably know Lisa Craig. She's been hanging around orbiting Nantucket and a lot of other important historic coastal communities. In fact, if you live in a historic coastal community, you have Lisa Craig to thank for a lot of her planning initiatives. She's the principal for the Craig Group, LLC, leading a team of design and planning professionals to support community leaders, local government, and nonprofit organizations in the growing economic value and protecting the architectural and cultural integrity of historic communities. She served for 7 years as the Chief of Historic Preservation for the City of Annapolis. And she spearheaded the Weather It Together Camp initiative, a cultural resources hazard mitigation plan identified by the National Trust for Historic Preservation as a national model for resiliency planning. Past work experiences include project executive at Forest City Military Communities, DC State Historic Preservation Officer, Director of Partnerships at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and Executive Director of the Historic Preservation League of Oregon. Nationally, she served as chair of the Cultural Heritage and Climate Change Committee on the board of the U.S. International Committee on Monuments and Sites. Thanks so much for being with us today, Lisa.
Thanks, Mary. I appreciate it, and appreciate the opportunity to once again speak to a Nantucket Preservation Trust audience. Some of you may remember we did this last year, partnering again with the town of Nantucket and the Preservation Institute Nantucket, and I'm glad to be back virtually again this year. As Holly had mentioned earlier, I'm currently working on a team that will be looking at issues of developing design guidelines, as well as addressing or providing a toolkit for historic property owners in Nantucket. But today I'm going to talk about the bigger picture. I'm going to talk about some of the work that I've been doing around the country that I think is translatable to Nantucket, particularly as we move forward with the coastal resilience planning effort under Vince. So this is about National Historic Landmarks at Risk. I stole that, for those of you who can maybe see my screen a little bit, from this publication, which is actually something that was developed by the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I'll talk a little bit about what this may mean nationally as I move along in the presentation. So we're going to focus on initiatives in 3 communities, obviously Nantucket, and then resilient heritage in the nation's oldest city in St. Augustine. And then finally, some of my early work, almost a decade ago, about 8 years, with the City of Annapolis on the Weather It Together initiative. Next slide. Just a little bit about my firm and what we are doing. I actually do have a number of people I'm working with around the country. Kimberly Rose, who is actually there in Nantucket, is joining me on my continuing work with Resilient Nantucket. Our firm is focused on a resilience goal for our cultural resources, our nation's historic sites. And our job is to help communities survive, adapt, and grow while protecting the places that contribute to their collective identity. We do this through a number of ways. Much of it comes down to partnerships, planning, and ensuring preparedness. The communities are prepared not just for disaster events, but for the future we heard so much about through Chuck's presentation and Vince's, the future of sea level rise. So resiliency to me means saving places. Next slide. Some of the communities we've been working with I've already mentioned: Nantucket, St. Augustine, and Annapolis, but also I'm currently starting a project to develop just what Holly was talking about, a hazard mitigation plan and resilience plan for New Bern, North Carolina, to incorporate cultural resources from that community. I'm also working with the state of Delaware, State Historic Preservation Office, which is looking at the implementation of its preservation plan. And then interestingly, Boulder, Colorado, the Colorado Chautauqua Association talk about an important National Historic Landmark site that incorporates natural heritage and historic resources. Again, they're working on a sustainability and resilience plan. I'm glad to be part of that. Next slide. So for those of you who haven't been told this yet, it is National Preparedness Month. Preparedness is essential. Preparedness is what we do to ensure that our families are ready for any type of disaster event. Unfortunately, we're dealing with an emergency right now with COVID. Believe it or not, we are learning a lot of that out of that will help to prepare for future natural disasters. And that's something I'll talk about more in the next coming months as we work on Resilient Nantucket and engage with community members. But it is a shared effort in every community, and everyone plays a role. And the point here is to learn ways to be better prepared before, during, and after an event. So keep that in mind, that this is National Preparedness Month. You'll be hearing a lot more about disaster planning, and please do take it seriously. Next step. Slide, sorry. And that's why I'm saying your first step should actually be to ensure that it's about people first. Many of us who have worked in government or who are consultants or are involved with historic properties, museums, and sites know that when we've experienced a disaster, the first thing we think about is our family, our home, is everyone safe? So to that point, we can't possibly be involved and concerned about historic properties until we know everyone at home is safe. So please do take these first 3 steps. Make sure your personnel take these steps. Have an emergency plan at home. The town of Nantucket, I put the link for the emergency preparedness site, Storm Ready. The program is there. They have some great information about how to prepare your home, your family for an emergency event. Have that in place, because only then can we start to respond to the short and long-term issues of disasters. Next slide. So I'm going to talk first about Annapolis. This is what Holly had mentioned earlier. We do have a hazard mitigation plan in Annapolis. If you can go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Annapolis is the landmark at risk. That is actually the report I showed earlier, National Historic Landmarks at Risk. That was something that came out from the Union of Concerned Scientists. And it really was talking about NOAA data that had been collected and authored into this publication, and then a subsequent publication called Encroaching Tides that talked about the greatest increase in nuisance flooding having occurred in Annapolis at 925%. And that was just about the time that we were looking at beginning the update of our hazard mitigation plan. So we went from almost 4 days to 40 days per year. But what was even more telling, as both Vince and Chuck showed, if you look over time exponentially, this is going to be increasing. And by 2065, nuisance flooding is estimated to occur 385 times each year in Annapolis. So clearly we had an issue that had to be addressed. I noted Margaret Ingersoll put a message in the chat, which I want to respond to. The Dorchester County, Maryland is really going to lose a significant number of watermen's villages. And I think that she asked the question about recreating a setting for Delaware's Zuiderzee, I think it is, museum, or with the Zuiderzee Museum in the Netherlands. I'm sorry, there's a similar one in Delaware. I think the recreation concept is something, Margaret, I'll get to in a minute. I think the very first thing we need to do in all communities is to document what we've got. And I think we're behind the 8 ball in so many communities, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But we can get back to that question later. So next slide. So why it's so important to understand this is because of that image on the right. And Nantucket has the same designations, a base flood elevation for a building, and that is basically the 1% annual chance of flood, or what we call sometimes the 100-year flood. Keep in mind that is a 1% chance every year, not a 1% chance in 100 years. So the baseline flood level, flood elevation in Annapolis is about 4.5 feet. That doesn't take into account sea level rise, and looking at a moderate rate of sea level rise over 100 years, i.e. Closer to the year 2100, it would be 8.2 feet of daily future conditions. So on the right, you see receding water from Isabel, which was our last major hurricane. This is what that would look like. What the blue areas are in the FEMA flood insurance rate map from 2016, that's what it would look like in the year 2100 if we did nothing in Annapolis. So this is why it's so crucial to understand. Right now, if a property owner wants to do new construction or substantial rehabilitation of an existing building, if it's designated as historic, they're exempted. If it's not historic, their lower floor level needs to start at 6.5 feet. So in essence, a full story almost of building construction above the floodplain area. And that is something that we're trying to understand in all communities, how we design for this type of future. Next slide. So Holly had shown this in her presentation. There is a process by which we can incorporate historic properties into hazard mitigation planning in a substantive way. We went through that 4-step process in Annapolis, and that's something that I now help other communities get started on. And so that is what we are doing, particularly in New Bern, but it offers us an opportunity as well in Nantucket. Next slide. Organizing resources. I think Nantucket has done a terrific job of pulling together all of the right players. As a matter of fact, one of the efforts that came out of last year's PIN work is being recognized as its first anniversary. Acclimate. That organization now has dozens of Nantucket-based groups and experts represented, and that is the very first thing to do, is organize those human resources, because the next step is really doing the critical survey work. What are those properties, as Holly mentioned, that are vulnerable to sea level rise and hazard events? What is their vulnerability? We don't just survey for purposes of architectural importance and historical significance. We also need to survey to understand what buildings are most vulnerable and how we need to prioritize those. So putting together the resources, and then the third most important of all those resources, funding. So we're very fortunate in the state of Massachusetts. Not so many states have funding dedicated to vulnerability preparedness and planning, and we have that. But we need to take advantage of continuing funds from the State Preservation Office, from the National Park Service, as well as from FEMA through the Maryland Emergency Management Agency. And matter of fact, we'll be talking about that tomorrow at a workshop. Next slide. So the second component in developing a plan is to, beyond surveying the resources, as I mentioned, for their historical significance, it's also getting down to, do you have an owner of that property that might be interested in mitigating or adapting the building to future conditions? That is something that FEMA provides for in their worksheets, and something that gave us the opportunity to identify property owners. Next slide. But then the other thing to understand is the economic vulnerability and the value the community places on historic resources. In Annapolis, we looked at the items identified by FEMA to evaluate, in the instance of a disaster, what would be the potential loss to the structure? In other words, to replace that structure or portions of that structure, what would it cost? How about the contents? We have a number of historic museums. What if we lost some of the contents? as well as private residences and commercial properties. And what about the function or use if you have a commercial building that it goes offline because of a disaster for a week or a month? What is the loss to the community in tax dollars, in sales tax and so forth? And then the displacement cost. If you're an individual that has to relocate, you've got to rent somewhere else. What is that cost to you as a property owner? The same to be said for a commercial establishment. We had 140 properties in the study area, and $288 million is what we estimated to be the actual loss. And there was a standard by which we developed that information, something that I hope to be able to work in the future with Nantucket about. But then there was also understanding the community value. What is the historic significance? That's a good thing to know, but what is the level of significance? Is it highly significant? Is it moderately so? Or is there low significance? Economically, how important is it to the community? What's the degree of the architectural integrity that remains? But here's the key. What does that place mean to your community? What is the public sentiment? It was interesting in Annapolis when we did this survey of our community, and we had approximately 485 people respond to an online survey, but over the period of 2 years public engagement, we total around 3,000 respondents. They said what was interesting to them, what was valuable to them was, yes, they loved the State House. Yes, they loved the Naval Academy, but really open the bars and open the restaurants, and then we'll know that everything's okay again. So our commercial core, about 40 buildings that surround our city dock area, were really the places that mattered to them. They wanted to be able to gather again, just as I think we're learning right now with COVID. And that's why it's so important to understand the places that matter in your community. Next slide. Once we pulled all of this information together, we basically drafted a plan and we planned for its implementation. I think we heard from Vince the importance of implementation. It's about how we incorporate funding, find the model projects, amend the public policies or change the regulations. And that's exactly what we did. We identified those needs and we were able to move forward to FEMA with approval of the Weather Together plan as an annex to our hazard mitigation plan. And it was the first approved cultural resource mitigation plan in the country. Next. A couple of key elements of that are important to continuing success is to just jump on board with other organizations as to what they're doing. Just make sure to integrate the efforts. So the efforts of the town should be integrated with Acclimate, should be integrated with the other organizations that are building resilience into the town of Nantucket, including regionally and including at the state level. So this is something that I continue to promote using existing programs. Keeping history above water was a great opportunity. I was so glad that Penn was able to bring that to the table. And I really do credit as well our good colleagues at the Newport Restoration Foundation. I worked closely with Shantia when this program came out. You heard from Holly, appreciate the shout out about hearing about Annapolis' work in Newport. So bringing those programs and individuals in to share their expertise is really critical. Next slide. And then as many forums as possible. Art is a great direction that Nantucket is taking, but we'll be doing a planning charrette, a design charrette as part of the development of the design guidelines. We encourage everyone to participate in that. You'll hear more about that later. Next. So St. Augustine, this is really where we started with the community value assessment. They haven't done a hazard mitigation plan with cultural resource base, but they have done a community values assessment. Next slide. And so we did some similar survey work that we had done in Nantucket. We wanted to find out if you owned a property or business. And what was interesting is a number of people didn't know either way. Obviously, it's St. Augustine, there's hurricanes, and we found it was fascinating that 26% of the population didn't know if they were in a flood zone or not. So pretty much my guidance is also to most people is a phrase that FEMA uses frequently. If it rains, it floods. So keep that in mind as you move forward with your own consideration of, should I get flood insurance or not? Yes, you should always have flood insurance, period, because if the waters cross one boundary and you have flood insurance, you're covered. There was some recent stats that came out about Nantucket that Holly had shared with me, that there's over 100 repetitive loss properties. But of those 100 or so repetitive loss properties, only 20 have flood insurance. Everyone should have flood insurance. That's my little pitch for the National Flood Insurance Program. So next slide. What types of activities should you take into account to increase public awareness? This was St. Augustine, but as you can see, developing design guidelines was at the top of the list. So here's to Nantucket for being ahead of the curve on this. St. Augustine has not gotten around to that yet. And as you heard from Erin Minigan yesterday, it's such a critical tool for our historic preservation commissions, but more importantly for property owners and architects and contractors who now have some guidance as to how best to design for a future of flooding. Next. And then sharing tools and best practices. This is something I'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide, but I think also the fact that Nantucket's ahead of the curve with PIN in its 3D laser imagery. That's something that I know that the University of Florida is wanting to work with St. Augustine, but that is something that Nantucket has already undertaken, and it'll be a very important component moving forward to help plan for greater adaptation at the building specific level. Next. And so again, similar to Nantucket, the citizens that participated in Resilient Heritage in St. Augustine selected their top 10 properties. And I'll say of the top 10 currently, 2 of them are owned or managed by the city, and the city has the opportunity now to move forward with some resilience planning and modeling, which they're doing. Next slide. But one of the things that really was a first, and what I hope we'll see in Nantucket next, is how to analyze the economic impact on a community. And so we worked closely in St. Augustine with Don Ripkema, who actually spoke at last year's Keeping History Above Water in Nantucket. And Place Economics, his firm, conducted an analysis. They studied the impacts from previous flooding events. They categorized those impacts. They then modeled future economic impacts on historic visitation, and they estimated the overall value of the heritage resources in order to understand why it was important to focus on the historic district's assets in terms of flood preparedness and mitigation. Next slide. So here's what we found. St. Augustine has 2,059 designated historic properties that are at a high risk for flooding. Those properties and beyond, heritage in general, generates for St. Augustine $2.9 billion annually. Keep in mind, this is a population of no more than approximately 12,000 people. 55% of the visitors are heritage travelers. And then using a travel cost method, something that is used often in Europe, but not so much in the United States, they were able to determine that during a 2-month period following a major storm event, St. Augustine loses 20 million in tourism, 300 direct and indirect jobs, and that comes to about $12 million in lost labor income. These are important numbers for us to understand in terms of both the value of heritage and the potential impact to our communities when we don't have heritage visitors because of incidents like a disaster event and the long-term disaster of sea level rise. Next slide. We also did flood mitigation decisions relative to 3 of the historic resources in particular, modeling those. And we came up with some guidance that was directly taken from the National Park Service's flood adaptation strategies. Marty talked about in his presentation, we did a whole long database of analysis looking at, we start with the basics of elevating utilities to and through dry flood proofing, wet flood proofing, elevating buildings and relocating buildings. Next slide, please. The other thing we did in St. Augustine, which I think is of value as well to Nantucket, and hopefully I will be bringing that to the coastal resilience planning effort, is we looked at other communities and how they were dealing with best practices in public policy. Everything from Norfolk and its zoning ordinance, using overlay areas for both incentivizing development away from coastlines and to inland areas, to Baltimore's disaster preparedness planning effort, which combines their 3 plans, their hazard mitigation, their disaster plan, and their general plan together. San Francisco's guidance for incorporating sea level rise into all capital improvement planning processes. Every capital improvement plan that is budgeted must look at the analysis of sea level rise. In Fairfax County, wetlands must be considered first before any hardening efforts. And so doing some type of living shoreline approach must be analyzed first and before any other type of barrier approach is used. In Boston, any development projects that come in must take into account future conditions. There's a checklist that they incorporate. And in Virginia Beach, they look at both the transfer of development rights and purchase of development rights options to ensure that new development is staying away from vulnerable areas. Just some of the best practices. Next slide. And then here we are in Nantucket. Some of this information has already been discussed, but I'll quickly go through what we came across in last year's a resilient Nantucket effort. These were 3 of the top actions, and actually I'm glad to say that we can certainly say that all of them are being addressed right now. Partnering with experts to identify cost-effective adaptation actions, developing a how-to workbook on adaptation, and then obviously completing and continuing to complete and enhance the 3D laser scanning work already underway with PIN. Next slide. Obviously, what came out of that again was a recommendation that the town of Nantucket integrate resiliency and adaptation measures into the existing design guidelines. So continually reinforcing this was one of the reasons why the town was successful in getting MVP funding. Continue. Next slide, please. Marty already talked about some of the arts elements that came out to create greater visual awareness of the impact, create a sense of urgency to planning for the future. Acclimate actually had discussed a ribbon marker program. They've got the laser lighting program that they've moved on to now. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. I don't need to repeat some of this information again. But signage, I think one of the most effective things we can do, and I've seen it community after community, is signing those high watermark events, giving a little historical perspective, making the history of flooding relatable and historically significant, but bringing it into current conditions, as we see with the images, the dual images of the Pacific Club here. Next. And as I said, now we're working on Resilient Nantucket Design for Adaptation. So we'll be looking at the streetscapes and the buildings themselves and developing a set of design guidelines to incorporate that into future planning for the historic district, for the entire island, because it is a National Historic Landmark. Anything that is usable and functional for a designated historic property is also purpose-built to be used for any type of older property. Next. And this is actually the progress towards Resilient Nantucket's MVP work this year. Right now, tomorrow, we'll be doing another community forum, and we'll be moving into a series of design charrettes and 2 additional community forums over the next year. I just had a communication with Phil Dyke, who is a coastal resilience and cultural heritage professional with the National Trust for UK. He will be one of our presenters. He's thrilled to be able to be online at least to do this for us. So we'll be hearing perspectives from all over the country. Next. I mentioned briefly the Secretary of the Interior's guidance on flood adaptation. This is something that we're looking at very closely and incorporating it into the cultural resource hazard mitigation planning work in Nantucket right now. These are all of the elements that the National Park Services incorporates. So we don't want to stick to just the concept of elevating buildings. There are other strategies that we can use to make buildings more flood resilient. Next. Adaptation strategies, including temporary practices of building wraps to raising utilities to dry flood proofing for historic properties. Next. And keep in mind, elevating buildings are not always about just exterior elevation. Looking at interior elevation, particularly if we have commercial properties that may be able to elevate to upper levels within the buildings to get above that base flood elevation. We need to be creative about how we address any necessity of elevating a building. Next. Something like this, obviously, you heard about Charleston's work, but Schenectady, New York, right after Sandy, developed one of the best examples of illustrated guidelines. Next slide. And they took into account the community, a lot of wood frame structures, much as we see in Nantucket, more so a building type than we may find in Charleston, being more masonry. But what was important was the State Historic Preservation Office was a partner in this. The concept being we need to save the entire of the community, the entire of the resource. If they're not mitigated, those buildings will become unlivable. So we have to start thinking in an open-minded way about how we sensitively elevate and or even relocate our buildings, or as we heard earlier, how we learn to live with water. Next slide. So here's an example of some of the illustrated guidelines. This is something we anticipate providing to Nantucket as we move forward with the development of those guidelines. Next. And as you saw in Charleston, we have to plan for the different building types, and in Nantucket, the different built environments, the locations. How do we deal with erosion versus how do we deal with flooding and sea level rise? So we'll incorporate this into the design guidance as well. Next slide. Again, site considerations, the character and context, and foundation designs. You saw some of this yesterday. Next. And I'll say this, having staffed the Historic Preservation Commission in Annapolis, we had a project that came in for redevelopment. And we sat down with the property owner and said, listen, you haven't incorporated any type of flood resilience in the building. You are just inside of that study area that we have. How about looking at some flood barriers? And so the developer came back very willing, developed raised terraces with perimeter planting beds that would help with the flood mitigation strategy for at least the next 50 years or so. So you can work with property owners and be proactive as a commission and staff. And I know that's something that we can count on Holly to do with residents there. Next image. So join us tomorrow, September 18th at 11:30 a.m. or at 6 p.m. To register. There's a link right there, Nantucket website. Just go to the town of Nantucket and you'll find the link for Resilient Act, and you can participate that way. And we'll have, just as a FYI, we'll have Sarah White, the State Hazard Mitigation Officer. We'll have Shannon Hulse from Barnstable County, and Joe Rossi talking about the National Flood Insurance Program, how Nantucket can participate in the community rating system and how that lowers everyone's flood risk, and what funding and programs are available to assist property owners with mitigating their historic properties for a future of flooding. Next slide. But I really want to reemphasize, are you disaster ready? Are you and your family prepared? Is your historic property prepared? So I encourage all of you to first be prepared individually, and then next, prepare that important historic asset for a future of rising seas. And that is it. I'm willing to take any chat here, Mary, if you want to facilitate that. I'm glad to have you go at it.
Okay, wow, will do. Is that the Alex Haley Memorial?
Oh, yes. This is the Alex Haley Kunta Kinte Memorial that's in the city dock area. And this happens to be, believe it or not, tidal flooding. This is not a major storm event. This is just tidal flooding. So it does kind of speak eloquently to this is for the future of our children.
Really incredible stuff. I remember, I don't know, I guess it was Labor Day, around this time of year, maybe 3 years ago, going home and reading everything on the Weather It Together page. I did like 8 hours reading everything that was.
It was a lot of work. Thanks, Mary. You're probably the only person that's read 8 hours.
That might be true,
yeah.
But I came in and I said to, Michael May, who's the executive director of MPT at the time, oh my God, we have to think about this. It's really, you led such an amazing example. So there was a question, I wanted to go back to Margaret's question.
Sure.
About Dorchester County,
sure.
Maryland. The idea of moving villages to recreate a setting. Have you seen that kind of projects there? Is there worry that places are going to lose their landmark status if buildings are being lifted, or what do you do? I'd never seen of the Waterman's Village, and I found some pictures on the Library of Congress website. Very cool little structures there. What are your thoughts on that?
I think I'm not a purist in any sense. I think that Marty made a really good point earlier, though, too. We have to well, first off, my big thing is documentation. We have got to document these buildings, and we have got to hear from the community what places are most important. And when I'm talking about documentation, yes, basic survey. Let's understand from a preservationist point of view how old the building is, who occupied it, why it's important to the community historically, architecturally. But then I also, let's take it the next step further. And Marty's done a great job with his team with the 3D visualization. So we've got some very effective, almost in essence, HABS quality, Historic American Building Survey quality documentation. But let's remember, it's not just the buildings, it's the settings that they're in as well. And this is where we start to balance preservation with other community needs and values and experiences. I think that if we first document the buildings, we interpret them to the level they need to be interpreted, and then we learn how we're going to say goodbye. And the reason I say that is I had a state preservation officer in North Carolina as part of a disaster training program that I've developed with the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, say exactly that. She goes, I saw so many buildings lost in Florence and people didn't know how to say goodbye. I think we need to learn that. And it may be that it is permanent loss, or it may be, as we're saying, is the community interested in a recreated experience? Reconstruction is a legitimate adaptation treatment because it's in the Secretary of the Interior standards. It is not a preferred, but if we're going to do recreation or reconstruction, let's think of it maybe similarly to Benjamin Franklin's home in Philadelphia. Folks have seen that. It's an outline of the building because they weren't exactly sure what it looked like. But some type of method, if it's recreation of a village, then I think that is a community decision. It may not be seen as historic, although I think if we think of Williamsburg, we're talking about exactly the same thing. So that was okay to do in the 1930s, and that recreated community is historic today as a recreated community, much like the Beinecke work in Nantucket. So let's be open and let's take the lead from our communities. That's what I would have to say.
Can you think, are there any examples that you could think of to, where that has happened, where communities have been moved?
Well, I think there are communities. If we look at Louisiana, and we look at some of the Native communities in Alaska and up in Canada, they are planning for relocation. It's not about the buildings; it's about the community. It's about those people. There's just no way that they can relocate an entire community's built environment, and that's where people first comes in. So I think it's more important sometimes to transfer those lifeways. I heard somebody talk about if we lose some of these major islands, you know, and we've been through that, or we're through that in the Chesapeake. You know, we've lost island after island in the Chesapeake Bay, and those people have relocated, but their lifeways have not necessarily. So the skipjack community, the fishermen, the oystermen, they've diminished. Again, I'm back to why we document, and Nantucket clearly understands this with the whaling community. We have to document those important buildings, places, traditions, lifeways.
There's a question and a comment. Fascinating that Annapolis residents wanted bars and restaurants even more than important institutions and historical assets. At what point does the government say no to the public? The historical assets are more important than short-term considerations. Isn't that the point of historic preservation?
Well, okay. Annapolis, part and parcel, the bars are historic and the restaurants are historic. So fortunately, those two go together. In some instances, the bars are not only the buildings historic, like Middleton's Tavern had been there and used as a tavern for 185 years, whether it was a tavern or restaurant, some type of gathering place. So they kind of went hand in hand, that particular use. But it's also, you know, it's one of those places people often talk about, a drinking town with a sailing problem. You know, it's about heritage tourism. And it's also just those gathering places. You know, people come down to the city dock and have coffee. They go to the pubs and have a beer at 5 o'clock. They come down for their provisioning to the local wine place when the sailors come into town. So it's not necessarily just about the fact they're drinking places. More importantly, it's their community gatherings. It's, you know, where the locals go. And I think that was why it was fascinating to me that those places managed to kind of eke out. Also, they're economic places. You know, they generate revenue for the city, for the business owners, and many of those business owners in those buildings are local residents. So it's all part and parcel, part of what defines that capital city.
Let's see, a couple other comments, questions? Deanne says, in Nantucket, we have such a history of moving structures as depicted in the image that Marty showed of the old Quaker Meeting House being floated across the water from Brant Point to its present location at the Dreamland Theater. Perhaps when documentation is done, consideration should be given if the historic structure was moved to its present location from somewhere else, like the Old North Vestry.
Exactly. Yeah, it is a treatment strategy. I mean, you know, places have flooded, erosion has occurred. Some places have been, that is true. And over in the Chesapeake, there was a couple of buildings that were relocated over from Smith Island. In Annapolis, we had relocated some buildings from flood-prone areas to other non-flood-prone areas. And as a matter of fact, there's one or two properties that I had recommended that we relocate closer inland just because of the fact that they are going to be gone if we don't move them. So it is a history, it should be documented, and it should be considered as a potential solution in the future.
And Timothy says, an exquisite recreation of a historical Queen Anne residence is the 1891 Corbin Norton House on Ocean Park in Oak Bluffs, which was paid for with the owner's private funds after its total destruction by fire in 2001. Yeah, there's all those levels of preservation, restoration, rehabilitation.
Yeah. And I think the reconstruction, we had the same thing in the historic district in Annapolis. We had a property owner who said, I'm betwixt and between. Do I restore it as it was, or do I construct new? And it is a personal choice. Both of those options were reviewed by our Historic Preservation Commission as concepts because of the fact that either way, if it's new construction, if it's in the historic district, the commission still reviews new construction and is still requesting that the new construction fit in with the character, even if it is going to be a new building with maybe newer materials, with a more contemporary look. It should look of its time, or it should look like the reconstructed building, if that's what the property owner would like to do. But again, document it, because even if it is reconstructed, there should probably be some things that are changed enough so that you're not confusing somebody 100 years from now that this is the same building that was constructed 300 years prior versus 100 years prior. So, you know, that's just working it out. But to me, it's always been up to what do you want to do as a property owner? You are the steward of that resource. So loss means you have a certain amount of empathy. So.
Try to see if there are any other questions before we wrap up. What can we expect to learn tomorrow at the town's presentation?
We'll be talking a little bit, just as you heard a little bit today, about what's been going on in Nantucket. Libby, the city manager, will address where we are with some work in Nantucket. And Holly also will be talking about, again, our historic resources that are at risk. But we'll spend the bulk of the time hearing from the State Hazard Mitigation Officer about mitigation planning at the state level, about the importance of preparedness at the local level, what funding sources are available to local communities, and what the state's priorities are in terms of mitigation. Then we'll be hearing a little bit more about the National Flood Insurance Program. We'll be hearing from Shannon about what's going on in the Cape, what information she can bring to the table and what assistance she can provide. She is a certified floodplain manager and is heavily leaned on by the state for the region, how she can work with Nantucket. And then we'll be hearing from one of the people that she works with regularly, Joe Rossi, who will talk both about the National Flood Insurance Program and how it is basically a community bank account for communities. He'll talk a little bit about private flood insurance as well, and talk about what your homeowner's insurance doesn't cover and what homeowners insurance could leverage when it comes to national flood insurance. So it really is about understanding the economics of recovery and what flooding and protection from flooding can mean to you economically.
Not to be missed for anybody who lives in a place where there's water. Well, thank you so much, Lisa, for your presentation. And I think Holly, can you put the link to that the conference signing up for the town's presentations tomorrow? All right, thanks, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now I guess I'll just say a little goodbye. I don't have anything prepared, but I just wanted to thank all of you for being part of this conversation. We will be reaching out again next week with the edited videos, with contact information from the presenters, with anything that was referenced. Please do check out the town's presentation tomorrow. Please also check out the Nantucket Land Council is having their State of the Harbor forum next week. There's a lot that's going on at Sea Level Rise Awareness Month, Climate Change Awareness Month. So I do hope that next year we'll be together in some form, and in the spring we'll be sending out a link with more information about Spencer Glendon's talk whenever that will be rescheduled. So thank you all so much for being part of this conversation. You can email me. I'll put my email in the chat if you have any other questions or thoughts. We're going to be sending out a survey as well. And that is really it. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day, and enjoy this beautiful overcast fall day here on Nantucket. And I wanted to also thank our sponsors, Remain Nantucket Fund at the Community Foundation, the Osceola Foundation, the Hosteters, a lot of leadership supporters that you can see on our website, nantucketpreservationsymposium.org. Oh, thanks, Dad, in the chat. Great.